Starting. We are live, Juan.
Okay. Okay, I think people are slowly joining. Welcome, everyone. We'll be starting in 1-2 minutes. Yes. Let's wait as the people join. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so we are going to start our online training for higher education institutions. I'm going to share my screen. We'll start with a short presentation explaining the rules of the game and the structure of the agenda, and then we will proceed. So welcome, everybody. We are very happy to have you here this afternoon, joining us in our online training for higher education institutions as part of the Social Inclusion and Engagement in Mobility project. First of all, we are going to start by giving a small introduction to the SIEM project. The SIEM project aims to give more opportunities in life for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds by increasing their participation in the Erasmus Plus program in particular, but also in mobility programs in general. It has 3 key objectives, which are widening the participation of less advantaged and underrepresented groups in mobility programs, increase the interaction between international students and local communities of underrepresented groups in order to increase intercultural exchange and visibility of international student mobility, and last but not least, in general, trying to make the Erasmus program more inclusive. But once again, this is applicable also. Everything we're going to discuss here can be applied to all kinds of mobility programs that your institution might be implementing. Now, a bit about the partners. One of the great things about this project is the diverse partnership composed of European networks, universities, and student organizations. For that, we have the Erasmus Student Network as coordinator, and then a number of universities, like the University of Vigo, the VUV from Brussels, and also networks of universities like the European University Foundation, who is also part of this training that is co-facilitated between ESN and the UF. When it comes to the objectives of this training, we want to present some of our key outputs from the SIEM project that can be useful for your institution. So these are useful materials, all of them completely available, things that you can use to start developing your own tools to make mobility more inclusive in your institution. We will be giving you also practical tools, practical exercises that will allow you to identify barriers to mobility in your institution. And lastly, we'll be discussing the creation of inclusion action plans for your higher education institutions. Now, when it comes to the technical aspects, as you can see, we have the webinar mode. Probably now we have more than 100 participants. Please feel free to share all your comments through the chat function. We will also have some time for questions and answers. The maximum number of participants that we can have in this room is 200. We have more registrations, but it's possible that not everybody will join. So hopefully everybody who wants to participate will be able to join this room. But there's also the possibility to follow the live stream for the first part of the training. After the first part, we will move to 8 breakout rooms to go on with the exercises, with the practical exercises. Each breakout room will have a maximum of 25 participants. And the session will be recorded. So this part of the session is being recorded and then will be disseminated. You can also follow it through YouTube. When it comes to the agenda, we have the welcome words now by me. I'm Juan, the president of the Erasmus Student Network. Then we'll move with the presentation of the SIEM research report by Wim Gabriels, our director. Then we'll present the guidelines for inclusive mobility promotion by Fabiana from the European University Foundation. Some remarks about the new measures related to inclusion in the Erasmus Plus program that I will also be presenting. And finally, as the last part of this session, we will have a small questions and answers times in case that you have any questions that we can address. and we'll give a small introduction to the second part. After that, we'll have a small break of 15 minutes, and we will proceed with the second part of the training, in which first we'll have an explanation of the breakout room exercises, and then we'll move directly to these breakout rooms. We'll be working with the mural. Probably many of you are familiar with this very nice tool that allows for a lot of engagement and interaction and also brainstorming. And then at 4:50, we will proceed with the closing and the next steps. So this is all from my side. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. We have more than 120 people. And now, Wim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juan. Thank you, everybody, for participating in our training. We're very happy to see so many interested people here with us today. I'm going to share a presentation, but we'll also use a Slido exercise to make the exercise a reflection process for you as well. So throughout the presentation, we will include several items where you will be able to vote or give your opinion through Slido, and there will also be moments where you can leave comments and input in the chat as well. So I'm going to start sharing my screen for the presentation. Just to highlight that our project or our workshop is based on the STEAM research report. But not only do we want to present you the research as well, but we want to give you enough tools and tricks to make sure that you can, make your mobility more inclusive for students that want to go on exchange. We had a quite intense research process where we did a student survey and a staff survey with the numbers are projected here, 12,000 students answers and almost 800 staff answers. We had also several focus groups from some of the universities that are also in participation here today at the University of Latvia, VUB. We also did 6 study visits. Unfortunately, due to COVID, most of them took place virtually, but we managed to try and gather a lot of different inputs when it comes to what problems and impact measures mobility has for students. Now, when we look at the respondent profile, we had 65% of the people that answered were mobile students, and this will also come back a couple of times in the results. And 35% are non-mobile students. So sometimes we will show you something that is answers from students that were actively on exchange, while 35% were students that have not taken part in a mobility, and they are reflecting on why they have not taken part in a mobility, which might be also very useful for us to understand why certain people decided not to be part of this type of experience. Now, you also see here a little bit the breakdown in bachelor, master, and different types of faculties, but I will not spend too much time on that. It's just to showcase that there was quite a big diversity in terms of respondents. When we looked at the students with fewer opportunities, we focused mainly on 4 groups. First generation students, ethnic minority students, low income students from a low income background, and rural students. We do have information from other backgrounds such as LGBTQ, caregivers, people that indeed have the responsibility or that are working students or mature students. So these are all included in the research, but we focused on specifically these 4 groups because they were the largest in our group and perhaps also in the student populations across Europe. So the first question that I would like to ask perhaps in Slido. So if you want, you can open slido.com on your phone or on your computer and use the hashtag SIEM _HEI, higher education institutions, but also hello. And you can vote on how many young people in Europe are at risk of poverty and social exclusion according to Eurostat. So you can just go to this poll. It should be active, so you can You can go and you can vote for the results. I see 16 people, 18 people have entered. I'll give it a few more seconds. So what we asked, or here we use the Eurostat number, because this is also when it comes to the program and when it comes to European information. Very often, what they are considering are people at the risk of poverty and social exclusion, and this is a measuring tool that they use for inclusion processes. We of course are aware that not everybody is at risk of exclusion because of poverty. There's other reasons as well, right? We'll talk about that for sure also later. You'll see people accessing the polls. Make sure that you keep your Slido active, because there will be more and more things coming throughout the event. See, 54 people have answered, so I'll give it one more second. Those that have not been able to answer can answer in the next poll as well. Yeah. So we see, for example, and most indeed have given the correct answer, that it's 26% of young people in Europe are at risk of poverty and social exclusion, which is quite a large number, a significant number of young people that aren't as well off and don't have as much access to opportunities as we want them to have, which is at the end of the day the reason why we all believe in mobility. We believe in the opportunities this gives to students, right? To young people to improve their life, to do self-development, and at the end of the day, these elements are what really matters, so that people have more opportunities in life because they take part and because they are more competitive on the career market, personal development through mobility activities. Now, the next question then is, how many students from disadvantaged backgrounds are reported in the Erasmus Plus program? So here the question is more, how many young people from disadvantaged backgrounds were participating in Erasmus Plus? And I do need to make a side note that this is based on the reporting information from the European Commission that is answered through your institutions in Erasmus Plus mobility tool. So this impacts a little bit the numbers, but it is also quite interesting to reflect on that specifically. "51 answers. Let's give it one more second. 61. Okay. So the correct answer is, and most of you indeed answered this, is between 7 and 12%. And this is indeed between that number of students. Well, I see Sophia is asking, indeed, I don't recall anyone ever asking about disadvantaged background. It is that students, when we're reporting in mobility tool, you indeed have to indicate if a student is from a disadvantaged background or not. And then they get reported in the European Commission, and the European Commission tracks this data. And we requested this data from the European Commission in 2019 in order to understand what was the current level of participation, which is relatively low. But of course, it's important to note that these type of things were not always mandatory in the countries, but also in different countries, and that not everything was always implemented as excessively as before. So now, because of these numbers, we're also been advocating towards the European Commission, but Juan will also talk about this more at the end of this session, of this part of the session, to make mobilities more, this type of support more accessible for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, does your university reference students to disadvantaged backgrounds? So does your university reference to students with disadvantaged backgrounds in your mobility strategy? So if you have a mobility strategy, does your university reference to the disadvantaged background in your strategy? It doesn't have to be a specific group. It can just be groups in plural or just in general, that there's an attention for these groups in your strategy. So 38% saying, 40% say no, more or less. Now it's more or less the same. So 40% say no, 37% say yes. There's also quite a large number of people that don't know, which is also an interesting element, because it might mean that not everybody is involved in strategic discussions at all levels. So that's also maybe something to take away, that these items are important to make sure that these are discussed at larger levels. So there's still quite a large group that doesn't have it or doesn't know if this is included in their strategies. Does your institution include international mobility in its strategic plan? So in its overall strategic plan, is international mobility important there? I see here the answer is predominantly positive, which is nice to hear, of course, right? That internationalization, though, although students from disadvantaged backgrounds aren't always considered there that much, internationalization at large is considered an important priority to be in strategic plans. So this is also very interesting, because this is also what our research has shown. So when we look at this, and this is a multiple choice option, so you should be able to access and respond to multiple groups. You can also scroll down, because there is quite a few list of young people mentioned. But which groups in your are considered students with fewer opportunities in your institution? So you can here indicate multiple answers on who is considered a student from a disadvantage or with a fewer opportunities in your institution. We see, we'll give a few more seconds for people to answer, because of course it takes a bit longer to scroll through. Yes, 88% indicate that students living with a disability are considered students with fewer opportunities. The same as young people from a lower income background and young people with health conditions. Ethnic minority follows together with LGBTQ, and young people from rural areas, young people that are not in education, employment, or training, or young people from urban areas are not really considered students with fewer opportunities in your institution. I guess it also depends a little bit on where your institution is located and the personal experiences inside your institution. So to also just recap quickly, indeed, we also saw that 93% of the universities have mobility included in their strategic plans, but only a third referenced disadvantaged backgrounds, which is quite close to what we were actually discussing here in the call. And when it comes to who is considered a student from a disadvantaged background, the results also mimic relatively closely what we were discussing in our call. So the majority of the staff in our research indicated indeed students from low-income households to be part of a disadvantaged background, as well as students living with a disability. Then after that, students from minority ethnic groups are also considered by 47%. And what we said here with Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3, this is, if you recall, the Erasmus program has these 3 different categories where universities are tailored into, depending on GDP. So there are some interesting items related to that when it comes to when who is considered a student from a disadvantaged background. So there might still be some prejudices that replicate itself inside strategic plans and documentation. Now, what we think is important is that people are able to define fewer opportunities better, and specifically at the institutions. So the European Commission has recently launched a more inclusive framework. Juan will also talk about this a little bit more in the future. And what is important for universities is that you are better equipped at defining groups with fewer opportunities. And what we suggest is, because we got the question quite often, how do you define on a local and university level who are actually your students from disadvantaged backgrounds? What are their profiles, right? So what we suggest is that you check if there's local research available to analyze local realities. What are the local population groups that are considered by your city or by your local regional government as students from or young people from minority groups, trying to understand what is the population density, the structure of your population in your city will also help to understand who is potentially registered in your institution. And that's also another tip or suggestion, is to work with the registration and student service department. They might know the profiles of your registered students better than you at the international office, because they work with those students every day. And of course, discuss with students directly. Engage with your local student councils, organize focus groups will also always help to understand who are the largest minority groups on campus and who maybe you want to tackle or channel or approach more in future mobility promotion. And then what is followed there is also that it's, of course, important to develop a strategy with several mobility targets in order to ensure all students with fewer opportunities are supported. So it might be interesting and it might be important to understand who your minority groups or students with fewer opportunities are in your case, and how you can mention them in your strategic plans in order to make sure that you earmark some attention to trying to get them to go on exchange. Because of course it's important that all kinds of people are able to take part of initiatives that you are organizing. So when we look at mobility offer, the mobility offer that we have is diverse enough to cover several needs of the participants. So do you believe the things you offer in terms of mobility programs are diverse enough? You can also answer here. So here the answer is a bit 36% of the participants agree, 29%, 31% consider this neutral, and also some people disagree with lower answers in the strongly agree or strongly disagree category, which kind of means that it's yes, people consider these mobility offers diverse, but to a certain extent. Which is also something that we kind of found in our research, but we'll talk about that more. And the next question is, we engage with students or student representatives to plan our programs. So do you engage with the students to plan next steps and to understand what they want so that you can cater better to their needs? So here we see the majority don't necessarily engage with students to plan programs. %30 agree, some answer neutrally, So what I suggest is also perhaps, I have another one, but in the next slide, but what you can also do perhaps is leave your comments here in the chat, and then we can go on to the next slide on what do you actually do to engage them in the decision-making process for your programs. Do you talk to the student union? Do you have focus groups? Do you determine your mobility agreements with other universities based on the demand of students? So maybe you can reflect on this, focus groups, student unions. So people are starting to reply here. You can also write it in the chat when we move forward to exchange some ideas, some best practices. So go ahead if you want, you can leave it in the chat while we go to the meeting with student councils, also with different groups, also meeting with refugees, student board of European University Consortium, which is also indeed a nice development that there's quite a few student boards in European University alliances and initiatives, interviews, campaign to lead the students. So you see quite a few feedback forms from the students, so to analyze who has taken part. An international panel of students, info sessions, communication campaign, and evaluation questionnaires. So a lot of different good practices are shared to see how students can be engaged in this activity. Next slide. So when we also looked at this, we noticed that the mobility duration is also something that comes back very often, right? So mobile students indicate that overall they went on exchange for 1 semester or more than 1 semester, while non-mobile students, when we asked them what they would want to do as a preference, majority still said that they would like to go for a longer duration. But as you can also see, some non-mobile students indicated they would like to go for shorter periods of time. And we also see that this is reflected in somehow the mobility programs. So you have, for example, Erasmus Plus studies is considered still the most popular program for students to go on exchange. Followed by, for example, other student study exchanges, while non-mobile interests for example, Erasmus studies is also still high, but also Erasmus Plus traineeships and, for example, volunteering abroad also scored relatively high for people, as well as short-term mobility programs. So this is also reflecting on the fact that maybe we can try and diversify the program offer different opportunities for young people to go on exchange and to enhance collaboration and engage with students in order to make sure that they support and take part in your initiatives as well. When we look at barriers to mobility, we'll still see that bureaucracy and all the administrative processes make it difficult for students to follow their application procedures. And here you'll see, for example, barriers that students that did take part in mobility perceived. So students need to advance initial costs, have a loss of income, or have additional depth. They have extending degree programs. So these kind of elements are still considered challenges. What we also see on the other hand, for example, though, is that duration of mobility is too long is not necessarily considered a challenge. So we can definitely also see that duration is perhaps not the key element that makes the barrier a problem of why some people want to go for a shorter mobility, but it is related to other elements that are higher in the barrier items, such as students need to advance initial cost and the loss of other incomes or family related issues. So the duration per se is not necessarily the issue. It's more the conditions that it creates for the students. Then we also have the non-mobile students, the blocking factors for students that didn't go on exchange. And these are related to insufficient funding, lack of flexibility, concerns about impact on your academic achievement, lack of knowledge of the opportunities to go abroad. So here you can indeed see what were the different problems that students that did not go on exchange experienced as problems. Now, what does inclusion and equality mean to you in the framework of mobility? So what does inclusion mean to you? This is also an open poll, so you can support, so you can drop keywords that you find important. I also see the question of, do we receive the poll answers afterwards? We can definitely also share some of these things later on. We will definitely send you a pack with all the information after the event. Accessibility, equal access, no barriers, the same chance. All students who wish to go abroad get that opportunity. I think that's indeed to give everybody the same opportunity to study abroad and to enrich themselves. Make training opportunities available for all. So I think here what we see a lot is, what comes back a lot is the words related to equal opportunities, the same opportunities, equality, which I think are very correct and nice reflections, right? So at the end of the day, we indeed want equal opportunities for people to go on exchange. And maybe here, another key word that was actually mentioned, customization, might be necessary indeed to make that happen. So when we go to the next slide, we see that inequality will always be present in society, but the goal is to organize mobilities or society at large, right, in such a way that it includes all people. So we started working with the social model to inclusion applied to mobility. So there, in the disability field, they started developing the social model to disabilities, and ever since this has also been applied to different groups that are not necessarily as represented in society, that are underrepresented in society. We see, for example, the traditional model kind of has this mindset that people have impairments or, issues that help them or prevent them from taking part in society, while the social model tries to reverse that, right? Because they believe inequality will always be present in society, and the goal is to organize it in such a way that it includes all people in society, right? So it's kind of the idea of switching this around, and people experience barriers in order to participate in society. And of course, for us, in this case, this means specifically international mobility and international student mobility. Now, what this means is that we look at barrier types in 3 different ways: institutional, environmental, and attitudinal. And we feel that we have the institutional barriers reflect programs that are being offered and regulated by institutions, and that impact access to opportunities based on regulations that are related to the program. So that might be elements that you do as an institution, or that are told by you to do by your national agency, or the programs that you're implementing. Environmental are related to societal factors that influence people's backgrounds and access to information, as well. So it's about what influences their environmental, their environment and their personal experiences. Then attitudinal are more barriers related to belief systems based on the personal beliefs or the beliefs by the people around them. And sometimes these can lead to internalized barriers, where people have personalized these problems, internalized these issues, and really believe this and feel these problems internalized. So here are some examples of this. So institutional funding and how funding is organized, for example, is an institutional element, while low income backgrounds and loss of income of a job, for example, can be an environmental barrier, and the attitude that mobility is seen as an opportunity for wealthier students is an attitudinal barrier. So this is how these three elements interplay with each other and create multiple barriers to take part in mobility. So this is quite, they interact, and when you try to look for solutions, you need to make sure that you also interact with all of these three and make this a feasibility. Now, when we look at this, it's important to indeed streamline your processes and outline what type of academic attainment you have, and to allow for students to encourage their concerns. So to make sure there's a safe space for people to report their issues. When we looked at student support, we noticed that students still indeed indicated that available funding and support with the application process is still problematic, and that 86% would also like more help choosing a host university. So information and tailored information related to the funding and the application and the host and destinations is still something that is quite important. So here we also see the type of mobility support organized in pre-departure activities. So we here see that people that went on exchange indicated that they felt the meetings with international officers, official briefing events, and group sessions were very useful for most of the cases. Gray indicates that they did not take part in this. So the majority of students indicated that they did take part in this and found them useful. But then we see a bit of a counter argument there, or counter activity there, that not everybody took part in student-led organizations, social events, or events with mobility alumni. And especially maybe in terms of COVID, might be also useful, the Skype sessions with international officers. While we see that what people express interest in is similar, is very high. So social events, events organized by students, and events with mobility alumni are also still scored very high. So we believe that means that it's important to engage with students in peer-to-peer approaches and tailor support during and after their mobility. So to provide in-country support for students. So while they are on exchange, they know who to contact from the host institution, but also the home institution in case they are experiencing issues, and to ensure more peer-to-peer engagement to promote mobility opportunities and make it more approachable for students, and to support health questions students might have, especially in times of COVID. I have to speed up a little bit more in order to finish this part. So the cost of living and the financial support here, we want to ask you, are the Erasmus Plus grants high enough to cover the living costs? Do you think the Erasmus Plus grants are high enough to cover the living costs of students? The majority of respondents are indicating that that's not the case. Some say neutral, some agree or strongly agree. I guess it depends on what type of mobility grant you have, potentially. But the majority of the people indicated that they disagree that grants are not high enough to cover the living costs. Now, the next question is, does your institution have additional mobility funding available for students from disadvantaged backgrounds? So do you offer specific additional top-ups that are funded in a different way within your institution? right? So I see quite a few people say that this is the top-ups are made available, but also quite a few say that this is not made available, and some indicate that this is not known by them. And the last question related to this is, when do students receive their grants? So do they receive it before departure, within 1 week of arrival, or within 1 month of arrival? Let's also see how this answer follows up. So the majority of the people indicate that they give the students their grants before departure, which is indeed a very good item or element, because we already saw that 86% of students indicated that they have issues with pre-financing their costs, right? So not being able to have their grants within the first couple of weeks actually means that they might struggle financing their expenses. So to reflect on that, we also saw that students, both students and staff members, indicated that a monthly average living cost is above 501 euros, which is also quite a high number, and the grants aren't as high. And when we're looking at the financial support offered versus needed, we can also see that 60% receives less than 50%. 60% receives less than 50% financial support, and that those that did not go on exchange but would like to go indicated that they need more than 50% of their grant covered. And this even becomes higher when it's students that have more financial, that have different backgrounds. So here, intersectionality has a big influence on this item. Now, and as I mentioned before, the advancing costs is still a very important item. So now when we look at experiences, and now I need to unfortunately go a bit faster because what I would like to highlight is that the majority of the people have very positive experiences, and that they a lower amount said that they did not always receive equal access to resources or opportunities in the home universities, in their host universities. So 34% of young people felt that they were treated unfairly or negatively, based on the different groups that you see highlighted here. The majority of the cases happened mostly related to other students or maybe professors from the host institution. And it is, of course, important to keep these things in mind. While most of the universities indicate that that students can reflect on this, and that international students have equal access to this information, that this type of problems, when addressed, don't necessarily always have a proper process for international students to complain or address these issues within their host institution. So that's maybe a big important point, that you make sure that students can actually signal issues that they have experienced. So as we mentioned, not that many people, or 76% did not experience any form of discrimination. 24% did experience discrimination. It's not a large majority, of course, but it's still 24%, which is still a significant number. And it is really quite interesting to see how this is divided. So we see, for example, that students from an ethnic minority group are 10 times more likely to feel discriminated on their exchange compared to their peers, and students from LGBTQI plus backgrounds 15 times more likely to be discriminated on during their exchange than their peers. So this is also quite interesting to see, or well, not interesting, it's sad to see, but it's good to know that these things are clear in our research, that these type of things still happen, and these are not good experiences for the students. Now, it's not all bad. Students with fewer opportunities report more positive impact of mobility on their personal development. And as you can see, there is a larger interest in further study or work abroad, interest in global affairs, new overseas context, and also a positive change in their values or ethical positions related based on their exchange. Now, so here we believe it's important that people develop a crisis plan, and that you engage local and regional authorities in making sure that students feel safe, not only on university campuses, but also in general. Now, so all of this comes from the research report, and it's also reflected in a big part of the guidelines that Fabiana will also present in a second. So we use all of this introduction and this research to introduce the guidelines for inclusive mobility promotion, which is a handbook targeted to you. And Fabiana, I'm going to give the floor to you. So I'm going to stop my presenter mode so that you can also introduce this a bit more in detail.
Thank you, Wim. I hope you can see my screen now. Okay. Okay, so thanks, Wim, and very happy to be with you today. Thank you for this. So as Wim was saying, I will briefly introduce to you the guidelines for inclusive mobility promotion. So before going into the details, let me just allow me just to thank my colleague from the European University Foundation, Caroline, who actually worked on this a lot and then drafted these guidelines. So what do we mean by guidelines? So this is a practical tool which has been designed for higher education institutions and IROs, aiming at addressing awareness on differences in the student population, but also better frame the characteristic of underrepresented students group in international student mobility. So within this short presentation, we will briefly go into the main barriers to mobility, so recalling some of the issues that we presented already. And the practical tool linked to this is called Diversity and Inclusion Student Mobility Review Form. Then moving to how to collaborate, so collaboration mapping, internal and external mapping, and to conclude briefly assessing how to promote inclusive outgoing student mobility. But as I was saying, you have a link to the PDF of these guidelines. I really encourage you to go through the document and check all the information, because as I was mentioning, we don't have the time to go through all the information listed, so this is just a brief overview. In terms of diversity and inclusion in student mobility review form, what are we talking about here? So basically what needs to be done at the institutional level to promote inclusive, diverse, outgoing student mobility. Why this would be interesting for you? Because this is a practical tool to support you in, for example, identifying underrepresented student groups within your institution, but also better familiarizing with inclusive mobility policies, and finally identifying the barriers to mobility that we explained before. Moving to what's been defined in the guideline as collaboration mapping. So here we are focusing on how to establish or even increase formal and internal and external cooperation. And what do I mean by that? Basically, by internal cooperation, the main departments, but also units with whom the institution, you can collaborate with within the institution. And then, as you can imagine, quite self-explanatory, by external cooperation, we mean external partners with whom you might want to collaborate with. As you will see, a session of the guidelines is devoted to the promotion of outgoing student mobilities. Why is that? Because as Juan will tell you in a minute, communication is key to make student mobility inclusive. what do we mean by that? On the one hand, the promotion should be done within the institution, so to your own student body. And here we have listed some of the items, some of the main ideas for you to reflect on how to promote student mobility within the institution. For example, the financial support, of course, this is something that is always coming, one of the main reasons for students to decide or not decide to go abroad, but also the support, the academic support, language learning, administrative support, and all kind of information session available for students. But by promotion, we also intend the promotion of the institution as a mobility destination. So as you can see here, the items listed are similar, but also some of them are quite different. For example, including healthcare and student healthcare, or welcoming program, support system for students. But yeah, again, this is just a main overview for you to further reflect on this. Then a final session of the guidelines include other two interesting tools, what we believe are interesting tools. On the one hand, we have these visualization metrics, which aim to guide IROs, international relation officers, in reviewing all the promotional material for the outgoing mobilities. And finally, a specific session on the key messages, because we had the impression, and of course, this is supported by evidence, that the lack of adapted communication seems to explain why students are not reached by communication efforts. But as I was mentioning, this is just a brief overview. So yeah, I thank you for your attention on this, but really invite you to go through the guidelines. Would be very interesting for us to collect your feedback on this. And that's all on my side. I can give the floor to Juan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabiana. And hello, everybody, again. We're going to discuss a bit about how the things that we have been talking about connect with the new priorities and the new elements of the Erasmus Plus program. So for that, I'm going to share again my screen. And basically, the idea of this short presentation is to give you the overview. Probably many things you have already heard about them, you're already trying to implement them in your institution, but we just wanted to give you the overview before we move also with the final exercise, to better understand how important inclusion is as a priority of the new program. And also, as you know, inclusion is a key transversal principle in the new program. There are a number of documents that is extremely important to take into account, and also, if possible, to get involved in their national implementation and in the implementation at the institutional level in your universities. The first one is the inclusion framework that has been published a couple of weeks ago, that already includes the translation of the principles that were included in the legal framework of the program. So this document is relevant for both national agencies and universities. The inclusion and diversity strategy, where also you can see many elements that are relevant for organizations implementing the program, like universities and for national agencies. And probably the most important document, the National Inclusion Action Plans, which national agencies are preparing every year now, and that will include many of the national measures that should be implemented to make sure that mobility becomes more and more inclusive. When it comes to the narrative, we see a big shift in the narrative, which is also very relevant, a move from social inclusion to an inclusion and diversity approach, more references to students with fewer opportunities, and also 8 barriers that are highlighted in the program. And the barriers are the following. This is also something that we need to keep in mind for the exercise that we'll do later. And also, as Wim said before, indeed, these barriers will always have a local context, right? So disabilities, barriers linked to education and training systems, economic barriers, cultural differences. The important exercise that we need to do is to see how these barriers apply to our local reality. For that, contacting with local researchers, contacting with local institutions can be extremely important, with local NGOs, etc., can be a very important step to make sure that our mobility programs become more and more inclusive. When it comes to the national action plans, there are a number of things that should also be taken into account, because, of course, depending on how these things are implemented at the national level, universities will have different tools to then work with the students. So when it comes to the top-up, for instance, we see that the criteria to apply that top-up will be defined at the national level, and therefore, it will be extremely important to be in close contact with the national agency to understand what is the criteria, right, to determine how this top-up is going to work, and how we can also, let's say, put some pressure to ensure that these top-ups benefit the students in the best possible way. Also, when it comes to the organizational support, these are the new measures, and also to the inclusion support that can cover up to 100% of the real costs for those students with special needs. And indeed, here, as we discussed before, from our research and from our experience, we have realized that the peer-to-peer support and connecting students to share their experience is going to be fundamental. It's going to be a stepping stone in the road to achieve more inclusive mobility programs. Also, the level of the grants, that is always a very complicated topic for the big diversity. As we discussed before, students find extremely useful all the information related to the financial support. So providing clarity about the grants can be defining in order to convince them to go abroad, because they need to have that clarity so they can organize themselves even before starting to consider applying for mobility opportunities. Knowing how the financial support is going to be can be a defining element that maybe will convince them to start the application process, or just to give up and consider that that's not for them. And yes, as a final note, this framework was recently published. It's something that is accessible to all the higher education institutions, and that provides many of the cues also on how projects can be selected, what are the new measures that national agencies will have to implement, and therefore how these measures will involve higher education institutions and organizations working with the program directly. And now, Wim, you can take the floor again to just do the final announcements before we go for the break.
Yes, Juan, thanks a lot for sharing these new updates that are coming out. It's very interesting to see how these developments are taking place and taking shape. And I hope that you will also be able to, together with your national agencies, shape your inclusion strategies. So as we mentioned before, you can find the guidelines on the project website. And we kind of used or went through, for example, the questions that I was asking you throughout the webinar. We're also, reflecting on the review form that, for example, is one of the tools that can help you as a self-reflection process inside those guidelines. Now, we will go for a very short break now for 15 minutes. And when we come back, we will do a more interactive workshop where we will split everybody in different breakout groups and talk more specifically about barriers and potential actions that everybody can take. So we'll do a type of exercise together with everybody so that we can go a little bit more into the nitty-gritty and the details of what students experience and what they can do. So we hope that you will also like that exercise and that we see you within 15 minutes, and that you enjoy a quick coffee, and that we see you on the other side. We will leave the room open. We will just put ourselves on mute, and we will come back at 15:45, where we will see you again for the next step of the exercise. Thanks a lot, and see you in 15.